computer. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I think there'll be a couple people trickling in, but just to kind of introduce you guys, a lot of you know Michelle from our RBI training that we had both last year, and then she came back this year as well in July to do an updated training for our staff who've just joined us. So Michelle in the last year has had some new stuff happen, so I'm going to pass the reins to her and let her kind of give you an update of where she's at and what she's doing, and then let her walk us through today's lunch and learn.
Okay, well, hello. Welcome to everyone. Looks like we have a really good turnout so far, like 30 people. Yeah, I'm Michelle Udd, and so I was with Kansas Kits and their infant toddler services through September of last year. I did leave there and I went to KU Med, which was kind of short-lived because it just wasn't for me. It wasn't dealing with infants and toddlers. And so it was a program manager in their telebehavioral health, which was extremely interesting, but it was very school-aged and very medically based, and it just wasn't, it just didn't tickle my fancy like infants and toddlers do. So I came back to infants and toddlers in June. I took a position with Greater KC Link. I am now one of their infant toddler specialists out of their infant toddler specialist network, who works primarily with child care centers, working with those teachers, infant toddler teachers, and helping them really promote their confidence, teach social emotional skills for infants and toddlers. It's really about infant mental health and social emotional development in infants and toddlers, which is really what I love to do. So also in the meantime, I started my own business called Building Connections. I serve as a special instructor in Missouri's Part C program called First Steps. So we are also team-based. We look different than Kansas in some ways. So as a provider in Missouri, I'm more of a contracted position as opposed to being employed. So I work evenings and weekends with families. So I have about, I don't know, 10, 12 kids on my caseload right now that I see on evenings and weekends, and serve families in that capacity, which is awesome to give me that perspective of going back into homes again and working with families, and I love it. It's really great. And then on top of that, part of my business is providing trainings and technical assistance to agencies who requested, such as Johnson County Infant Toddler. And I've also do stuff for MOAIM. I also serve on the board of Missouri's Association of Infant Mental Health. And we are trying to get ourselves up and going and trying to get some endorsement process in place for which you all in Kansas had done. I know when I worked over there in Kansas, there was some kind of capacity to have endorsement for infant mental health. I don't know where that is right now. It kind of ebbs and flows with money, of course. So, yeah, so I have a lot of experience. I've worked with Children's Division. I've worked in preschool, obviously childcare and early intervention services. So that is my background, and I recognize a lot of you from when I've been there in Johnson County. So, so yeah, with that being said, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. Are there any questions for me before we get started? So today's Lunch and Learn is we're going to focus on communication and language development in infants and toddlers. I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see that? Okay, good. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about communication and language development. Keep in mind, this is definitely from a typically developing perspective. So I know a lot of the children that we work with often come to us with communication delays and language delays. So we're going to go over and talk about what those milestones look like from a typically developing child through age 3. And then we're also going to, I plugged in a piece at the end, which is really interesting for me and what I do, and probably what you do too, is for the multi-language learner and what that looks like for them, and just kind of go over some different scenarios with that. So I'd really like this to be as interactive as possible. I know that that's not always easy with as many people as there are, but if you do have a question, please make sure that you just unmute yourself and let me know. I'd love to have some kind of discussion, or if you want to clarify anything like that. So, okay, so how come sorry, I had to stop share because my screen is not. Okay. So our learning objectives include, we're going to talk about milestones from birth to 12 because they look really different than those communication milestones that go from 12 to 36 months. So this, I failed to explain also. So this training is actually, I'm a certified trainer for the Growing Brain curriculum out of 0 to 3. So I had gone to Washington, D.C. to sit on one of their Train the Trainers. And so it comes with 7 different units, and this is the communication units. So I have to use their slides in order to use their curriculum. So, but we're not going to talk about the communication milestones from 3 to 5 because we don't serve children 3 to 5. But I just wanted to let you know that that's kind of where that comes in. I can pull their slides out. It's typically a 3-hour training. I've condensed it into about an hour to an hour and a half, depending on how many questions and discussions that we have today. So, so that's why there's that 3 to 5 on there. So then we're going to learn strategies to support learning and early communication and understand multi-language learning. So we're going to start out with talking about how communication skills emerge very early. I think this is fascinating because we know that children begin learning communication long before they say their first word. And so watching how those skills emerge over time is really amazing. So we know when babies are born, how do they communicate? I mean, they cry. It's their only way to communicate in the beginning. And then they move into using some facial gestures and ultimately then using some of those sounds and things like that. And we're going to talk about some of that frustration and challenges that children face as they're growing through that point where cognitively they have a lot of things in their head that they want to communicate to you, but they don't have the words that come out. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of that challenging behavior that comes with learning language. And then just that there's a strong connection between language development and brain development. So this is called the growing brain. So I'm going to refer back to different parts of the brain that actually affect their language and their language and how they learn to talk. So they start out with some communication skills, like I said, before they even begin before they even have their first word. So in research, it shows that the fetus can hear external sounds in utero and recognize and prefer the sound of the mother's voice by 30 weeks gestation. So when that baby's born, they're born wanting to hear mom's voice. I don't know if you've ever worked with some of those newborns that cry and then, you give them to mom and suddenly they just go, they feel so much better as soon as they hear mom's voice or smell mom or that kind of thing. So, so long before even before they're born, they recognize mom's voice. It provides them a sense of comfort. And so it's really important that mothers talk to their babies all the way through even, that newborn stage. So newborns cry, and that's how they communicate. And that's called reflexive communication. It's involuntary. It's usually in response to a stimulus of being cold or hungry or wet. And so they just do that. And that's how human babies are born, to just really communicate at the very beginning. And then we move into that intentional communication, which usually happens around a year old. And that's when you get that awareness of they're speaking with some kind of purpose, some kind of goal in mind, that they want to give you a message so that something can happen for them. And so that's what they're working towards all the way from birth. So we'll talk a little bit about their unique cues. As we work with families and maybe have children of our own, we know that babies begin to use different sounds and cues to indicate different needs. So when we're talking to moms, newborn moms that may have had their baby home just a couple of weeks, we start talking to them, well, Can you understand different cries that they have? Do you know what that means? Do they make a different sound when they're hungry than when they're tired? We start talking to them about trying to discriminate between what their child's cues are of being hungry or tired or wet or that kind of thing. So eventually most parents do recognize those cues and kind of follow, like, I know what my child needs. At about 6 weeks, this is when parents really start like falling in love. Not that they didn't love their baby before, but when that baby just turns around and smiles back at them and those kind of things are like, oh my gosh, they're smiling at me. It's just so wonderful. So that usually starts around 6 weeks old. And the parents really start bonding with their child with that. And that smiling is usually a lot of that social smile. It's kind of reflexive, kind of a smile that just starts developing in them. They usually start cooing around 8 weeks old, where they use a lot of vowel sounds. And almost at 8 weeks old are already starting that back and forth kind of I coo, I wait for you to say something too, kind of a thing, so that they already are in their brain already starting to get that conversation. One person talks and then another person talks. And it's amazing to me that at 8 weeks, they can already start having that reciprocity and conversation already. It's often called that serve and return. The Center for the Developing Child out of Harvard talks about that serve and return and how important it is to do that with your developing babies, because it really does promote a lot more language than we sometimes give it credit for. We just think it's cute. Oh, look, they go back and forth, but it really does actually promote a lot of brain growth in the areas that, that really stimulate language. So at 3 to 4 months, babies start just outright laughing and having some laughter. If you tickle them, they will laugh. And, you know, I mean, who doesn't love a baby laugh? It's just so adorable. And it gives parents a whole new interaction level with their kids as far as, oh my gosh, they're laughing. And, you know, every time I tickle their neck, they laugh. And, you know, parents love that stuff. Babbling usually begins around 6 months of age, where they have more of those complex sounds of gaga. They usually put a consonant with that vowel. So the cooing is just vowel sounds. The babbling is usually a consonant vowel, gaga, da, da, ba, ba, that kind of stuff. And this is when, and this is fascinating to me, it's when you look at kids learning language, because that babbling, they'll start using those sounds that are really strong in their home language. So it's those sounds that they've heard for the last 6 months or before that, these are the sounds, the core sounds that they'll start using in their home language. So a child from another country would actually wouldn't necessarily say ga, ga, da, da, ba, ba, because those are more of those English sounds. You know, they'll say more of those other sounds that go with their home language. It's very fascinating. So all of these primary and foundational skills are the pathway to intentional communication. And so we really want to keep those kids kind of talking and going back and forth, even though, you know, they're not talking, I call it talking, but that communicating, kind of going back and forth and making sure that they understand that because this is where you build into that intentional, where they actually start making a sound and they realize that somebody is going to respond to them. So this is where, like I said, adult responses are critical. Sounds and actions can elicit those responses. So they say by as early as 5 months old, babies have learned to elicit a response from their parent or caregiver, and this will begin to form their awareness of their social effect on people. So by 5 months old, which they still look like, you know, they're just itty bitty babies. And some of the babies that we work with don't necessarily move along this spectrum of communication development as quickly as what we're talking about here. But yeah, by 5 months old, a lot of times they'll make a sound and they'll expect some kind of adult to kind of react to them or be responsive to them. And these types of conversations with babies that are starting to produce that non-cry sounds, so those babies that are, you know, not using crying as a way to get an adult's attention, they're actually using sounds, really start having an effect on that long-term developmental outcomes. And it says, in general, the more responsive parents are to babies' vocalizations, the larger the baby's vocabularies are at 15 months. So those things that they can understand. So the more, so much of this is happening before babies can ever really say their first word. I think sometimes we don't understand the importance of how great an effect that adults have on a child's communication level before they can even, at 5 months old, and how that really will affect them at 15 months and, closer to 2 years when they're really starting to use a lot of language. Let's see. Oh, we're going to do some parent ease. So parent ease is sometimes called infant-directed speech. Infant-directed speech, and it has kind of a high sing-songy, what I'm talking about, those very exaggerated voice and, repetitive statements. Oh, mommy loves you. And, you tend to refer yourself in the third person and what are you doing? And, and the fascinating thing about parent ease is that no one teaches an adult to do this, but most adults do this all around the globe. Adults engage in some kind of parent ease where they feel like they just start talking, like I said, in that higher voice and that kind of thing. And babies begin to learn those speech patterns through that parent ease. And they typically respond with parents with those wide eyes, like this little baby here when he's just kind of like looking at the baby and the baby's like, oh, look, they're talking to me. So, and when they started studying like parent ease and kind of the effect on brain development, they found that babies actually seem to prefer parent ease, like a parent who talks to them in that very short or simpler and repetitive statements, because they process that visual and auditory information more slowly. And so when parents exaggerate their facial expressions and they kind of draw out what they're saying, that it helps babies to kind of really keep in tune to what the adult is saying and kind of keep in touch with that and keep that processing in their brain. It says babies are beginning to notice speech patterns during parent ease. So again, parent ease often uses home language sounds predominantly, those words that we're going to want that child to say eventually. So we use a lot of those. Research shows that during parent ease that babies will experience increased blood flow to the frontal area of the brain, even while sleeping and hearing their mothers using parent ease. So if the baby's sleeping and the mother comes in and says, oh, you're just so beautiful, that they actually can sense a response from babies who, while they're sleeping, can still hear that and process that. The patterns of parent ease seem to help babies with discriminating vowel sounds and syllables, as well as segmenting and recognizing words, like I said. So we're kind of using those words that we would expect them to use later. It will increase brain activity and attention to important or meaningful words during parent-child interactions. So research supports the idea that infant-directed speech plays an important role in language acquisition. Yeah, and also the research shows that brains react to the language in both the motor and the communication parts of their brains when they hear that speech sound. So it really helps with some of their motor planning. So when we're working with babies that, and I have a child on my caseload right now, he's 2. He understands everything. He uses some words, but he seems to have some motor planning issues as far as being able to say the words back out. And so they talk about this parent ease and how it does help with stimulating that motor part of their brain and that motor planning part of their brain that really helps them develop sound later. Researcher Patricia Kuhl concluded that the use of parent ease is a good way to promote both babies' growing language and their social skills. And another important research study found the more babies heard parent ease at 12 months old, the more they babbled and had a larger vocabulary at 24 months, when parent ease typically and naturally tapers off. So, as parents, we don't keep going in and talking to our babies in parent ease. Again, it's one of those things that it's not taught, but as our babies start using language, we tend to, as parents, stop using that parent ease and that kind of shorter, simpler, repetitive statements, and we kind of broaden our own vocabulary with children, which also helps them learn further communication. Okay, I'm going to take a break here. Does anybody have any questions about, I'm sure there's plenty of speech therapists on here on this. Does anybody have any questions, comments about parent ease, kind of things that they've used that helps them with the parent ease?
Hi, I'd like to jump in with a question. My name's Jana, and I am also a speech therapist. And I'm kind of looking at my teammates here, but as you're talking through all these developmental milestones, I'm thinking about children that are in the NICU for those first how many ever months. And I have limited experience with what that actually looks like, but are they able to have that parentese with mom and some of that type of, well, I say mom, parents, I'm sure there's some nurses in there, but just kind of looking at developmentally, what have you guys seen for a child that's in the NICU for a while?
Yeah, so just the timing of that is very interesting. I just did an evaluation last night on a 4-month-old who just came out of the NICU. She was born right at a pound, and she is now about 7 pounds, and she looks like a newborn. And so she is 4 months old, who looks like a newborn. She doesn't have any of those communication. She's not exhibiting any of those communication things that we would look for even in a newborn yet. She was exposed to a lot of drugs, and she's with a foster family now. And she didn't have, like you just said, she didn't have a lot of that primary caregiving. The foster parent was assigned when she was newborn, but the foster parent couldn't get in there every day. And I'm sure there were nurses talking to this baby, but yeah, she's probably going to be behind in some communication because she just didn't hear all of that language that is required to kind of build upon a lot of those other milestones. I would suspect that she would probably have some delays. Does anybody else have any experiences with that? Yeah, it's hard, like I said, when we're talking about children in early intervention and some of their background, where I am going to go into kind of like words and how kids learn more words. Children who tend to live in homes who receive welfare tend to have fewer words spoken to them and have a smaller vocabulary by the time they reach school age because they just don't hear as much language. So we're going to talk about that. But yeah, inevitably, depending on how much time a child spends in the NICU, you might find some language and communication delays.
Michelle, this is Leslie with Johnson County Infant Toddler. I guess it's all of us. Sorry today.
That's great. I love it.
I'm kind of all over the place today, I think. But anyway, I was just thinking, in addition to the language piece of things, I'm thinking about the social emotional and attachment piece that's very, very important and is part of that social communication. As part of even like response to touch or their cry, like if the baby's crying, a parent responding to the cry, I'm going to say in a, appropriately, things like that. Would that affect also some of that just overall development and communication?
Yeah, because I think when you get down to that communication development, like you just said, it's really about an overall responsive caregiver who is, being responsive to a baby who's making sounds and and then that social piece of the brain and, the language and the motor, they're all, while they're in different parts of the brain, they all kind of work together and develop together. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that social emotional piece will always have a bearing on the communication too, because children who have that responsive caregiving tend to have more communication with them.
Well, and I think you were going along the lines of maybe there, if there's a lower socioeconomic status, there may not be as many words spoken, but I think there's also additional factors that play into that responsiveness as a caregiver. For example, if a mental health challenge, any of those types of things that would be challenging to a caregiver that would impede their ability to respond or talk the parentese and so on and so on. Correct?
Right.
I mean, would you agree with that, I guess?
Most definitely. I really would. Yeah. I mean, when we're looking at, like I said, we were looking at completely typically developing children and going through their milestones, because when we're looking at families that struggle with, either socioeconomically or with mental health issues or anything like that, that can't always be that responsive to their child. You're probably going to see, other social emotional issues too. And like you said, I mean, and the words that are spoken to children that are of a lower socioeconomic level are different too. It's a lot of don't do that, where as you build upon families who, and they broke it down into like working class families and professional families, and they said that families, which I'm not really sure I like the way they broke that down into those labels. However, they were just talking about professional families who use a lot more words when interacting with their children and that kind of things, and that they're, typically more positive, so that the child feels better about themselves, those kind of things. Is that what you were talking about?
Yeah. I would. Yeah. All of those. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a whole slide on the word gap, and we're going to talk about kind of what happens when your child isn't developing typically in communication. But yeah, it definitely affects all areas of the brain. This training was really interesting because they tried to break it down into like communication and social emotional and behavior and things like that, but it's all really tied together when you're looking at a birth to 3 child. So,
well, and I was just going to say too, like you mentioned that serve and return, if kids aren't serving in the way and the parent's interpretation is my child is not isn't responding to me, then the return probably looks different from the parents. So it's almost like this kind of cycle of interaction, parent-child interaction, that I feel like parents, caregivers and parents, kids can get into that would affect communication. Again, that social emotional, that social communication, reading cues, signals from your child, that kind of thing.
right. Yeah, definitely. I definitely agree.
Hey, Michelle, this is Casey.
Uh-huh.
How's it going?
Good, how are you?
Good, doing well. So we typically, I feel like as a speech therapist, we typically take kiddos about 18 months, is as early as we go. So what's your opinion on us starting interventions if parents, I don't even know if parents know to be looking for different kinds of consonants and babbling. How early do you think is too early for us to intervene? Or is there even such a thing?
Well, and I think that that I wouldn't necessarily say that a 5-month-old needs speech therapy, but if that provider that's going in is a special instructor or an OT, still giving them strategies on how to elicit babbling and how to stress to the family how important it is for that parent ease and that serve and return communication, and looking for cues in their child's communication as part of their, whatever, reason that the child is in care for. But I would definitely promote and encourage speech and communication strategies from birth on, because there's so many of these things that you can do that will help them learn words later. You know what I'm saying? It's not like we wait till they're not saying words and then try to go back and say, oh, hey, they're not saying words, let's work on it now. What they're saying is that let's work on it at the beginning, and then we can build, a better and stronger communication skill set for that child.
Yeah, so maybe just kind of doing more of, like you had said, like a joint plan, or like a joint team approach with an OT who typically takes those early on kiddos, or a PT, and just kind of providing support. That's a great answer. Thanks, Michelle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So. Okay, so here we're going to get into the gaze and the joint attention, which again, as we know, autism itself is getting diagnosed earlier and earlier. And some of that is because of how a child is then interacting with their primary caregiver. So this gazing is really important. The gazing happens before joint attention, and that's when the child is looking at something and either the parent follows the child's gaze, or the parent is looking at something and they kind of get the child's attention to look in the same way. So for instance, the way they kind of described it was, let's just say the family dog Sparky walks through the kitchen or something like that, and you look at the dog and you see that the child's looking at the dog, and you're like, oh yeah, look at Sparky the dog is walking through the kitchen. So it's again, as a speech therapist, you probably already know you're giving families words, kind of doing that play-by-play for kids, but not everybody knows that. And so kind of explaining that to, like you had said, Casey, if families who have children that are in care or receiving intervention, for other reasons than communication, can still be working on, and being told the importance of kind of all of these things. The adult gaze gives a good cue about meaning to the baby. So the baby they're going to constantly look at you. I've ever seen the babies that are looking to you for your reaction to some kind of a situation. So if somebody else walks in, they look at you to see if that person is safe, that kind of thing. So that baby is using those gazes to kind of read and kind of bring in information. It's really important that we make sure that we're kind of following that child's lead as far as what they're looking at. And again, looking at that joint attention, which again could be like a baby sees, something really cool on a shelf, like a snow globe or something like that, and they look at it and they point and they go, and they don't say it, any words, but you look at that and you're like, oh yeah, look at that, that's really cool. And you start talking about that. That joint attention and that sharing of something interesting between the two of you is really, a bond, and it's a very huge learning concept for children, that someone is paying attention to what they're looking at too. So it's really important that we do use that joint attention piece. And we're going to talk about that in the next slide, is the power of joint attention. So the joint attention usually starts at around 10 months old, when they start realizing that they can look at something and you might look at something with them, and that might be of interest to you, and you might start talking about that, and that also elicits some kind of interaction with you, which usually, babies love to be interacted with by their caregivers. And so that usually starts about 10 months, and it's usually mastered. Joint attention is usually mastered by about 12 months, and you're typically developing children. And all of the research, it says, hey, by about 12 months, we should see children who have some kind of joint attention. I'm looking at something, I point at something, and I'm trying to get the parent to look at it too. So this is right about the same time frame that babies begin to communicate with intention also. So that joint attention and that communication really overlap and are really linked to children's vocabulary at 2 years old. So the more words you're giving them before they can say, the more vocabulary they will have as they grow older. So research shows that the joint attention is initiated, if it's initiated by others for the baby's brains is activated in the visual, attention, and the social processing areas. When the joint attention is activated by the baby, it activates areas related to social learning, decision-making, emotions, and reward processing. So they actually feel kind of a reward when they're the initiator of joint attention, and someone gives them attention for what they're looking at. It actually gives them a sense of a reward, which I found really interesting. So again, this is an important communication, not only a communication milestone, but as a cognitive and a social emotional well-being of the child and their development in that. So yeah, the joint attention supports the development of cognitive skills, such as learning through imitation and social referencing, which means that the baby's tendency, again, to look at the adult on how do I react to this. So like I know when I work with the little ones, when I'm first meeting them, they'll typically look at their parent or their caregiver to say, should I interact with this person or not? Because I'm not sure. And if the parent smiles and, they're talking to you, usually the child will warm up to you more quickly than if the parent is, not as happy to have you there as some. So it is, again, that social referencing piece. They're really starting to learn from their environment around them. Let's see, this, following a child's lead, showing interest in what they're interested, or by showing something in her or her world around her, is the ability to, the adult's gaze begins around 6 months. So again, yeah. So any questions around joint attention? Again, this one is a big milestone for like how they start looking at is the child able to engage in their environment, and are they able to engage a caregiver? Are they able to engage other people? Do they need that in their world? And it kind of is one of those things that builds on and is learned through communication. So communication milestones looks for family members when named and responds to names. So this is where around 6 to 8 months old, babies will look for family members when named. So again, the family dog, mama, dada. From about 6 to 8 months old, they should start understanding that people have names, and that, you know, those names kind of go with those people that are their primary caregivers. They say around 6 months old, babies also recognize and respond to hear their own name. I can't say that, you know, I work in early intervention. I can't say that that always happens. I don't know. Do you all have a good experience of babies who react to their own names by the time they're 6 months old?
This is Kelly. I feel like it's usually a little bit later.
I do too, but that
Yeah.
was in there, and I was just like, and that's why I was going to ask you all about it. So I'm like, I'm sure there'll be some speech therapists on you, but I was, you know, as I was studying it, I'm like, I haven't seen a whole lot of even typically developing 6-month-olds that respond to their name necessarily at 6 months old. So anyway, I just needed some confirmation on that.
And as a PT who doesn't know all that about community, I just think it's hard to decipher. Are they responding to their name, or are they responding to the voice, or are they responding to something else? So I think it's hard to identify it as being specifically their name that they're responding to.
Yeah, it could be. Again, I think it depends on how often that they're called by their name, because sometimes, you know, they get little nicknames by different people in the house, and they're not always called by their name. You know, I've been to several homes where they might call him, you know, by his first name, and then maybe by his middle name, and then maybe call him Bubby, and then maybe call him, you know, something else. And so, yeah, so I think it kind of depends too on how often the child, you look directly at them and you say Johnny, and then Johnny knows that that's his name. That when Johnny is said, that you're referring to him. So, so around 8 to 9 months old, this is really an amazing time for me when I see them, you know, between 8 and 9 months old, because it's, you really start seeing that intentional communication starting to come out at 8 to 9 months old. So, you know, I even have like some of my little guys in mind that, you know, by 8 to 9 months old, they start waving hi and bye, and they, you know, they start understanding that if they do something, it actually does, you know, it actually provokes a response from someone else that makes them laugh or smile or something like that. So, but typically when we get into that in that early communication, there's 3 main messages that they have when they're kind of engaging in some intentional messaging or communications. And that's for the adult to stop something like, stop wiping my face, you know, turn off that music, or, you know, this is too much, or it's too loud. You know, when they want something to stop something, you know, they'll kind of give that message to their parents. If they want their parents to do something, like I need to get that toy, I want that cookie, you know, I need help, you know, put their arms out to be picked up. That usually starts around 9 months old, where they really kind of reach out for a caregiver. And then that third one is to share and join attention, because you'll start seeing that develop around 9 months old. Well, they'll really start, you know, looking at something and wanting you to look at it with them. And it may be just with their gaze, because, you know, they're usually not pointing at 9 months old. Usually that starts between 9 and 12 months old is the pointing, but just by like where they're looking at, sharing and some joint attention with them. But this really promotes a lot of that reciprocal interaction during a really rapid period of time. So really the main point here is that in 8 to 9 months old, the communication that baby has learned is amazing, depending on how much exposure they've had and how much responsive caregiving that they've had in their environment. It makes a huge difference. Oh, here is my next slide. So pointing begins between 9 and 12 months old. So when they start to point, they obviously don't always have the words. So, but pointing is a very powerful movement for them, because sometimes it means, you know, they're pointing and they might, you know, you need to do a grunt, and they might be asking a question, or they might be telling you that they want something, or again, to establish some joint attention. So that pointing becomes very powerful for these babies who now understand that if I put my finger out like this and I point at something, then that gives you more of a reference of what I, to fulfill my need, whether it's a, a want or a need, or I want you to look at something. So it's really a huge development in communication skills is that pointing. So, and at some point too, they're beginning to understand simple requests at about 9 months old. So if they're sitting in their high chair and they're eating a cracker and you say, can mommy have a cracker? And then, they pick up a cracker and they give it to mommy. And of course they're reading what mommy does at the same time that mommy's asking for a cracker, she's putting out her hand. But again, that's helping them understand kind of that simple request and kind of those questions and again, giving them words to what they're doing. Okay, so first words. Babies typically will say their first words around 12 months old. Depending on what kind of foundation has been laid prior to 12 months old. I don't know about you all, but I had 2 kids, and one was a really late talker, and the other one, I swear she came out talking. So she just had words for all kinds of things by the time she was 12 months old, and it blew my mind away at how many words that she had, particularly because my son was not so quick to talk. So some of this too, I really look at it as, kind of just the way they're wired and how much communication that they're able to take in. So because again, if a child isn't saying their first word by 12 months, I certainly wouldn't refer them to the early intervention program. But it is something to look at. Are they doing all these other ways to communicate prior to saying their first words? So that I just wanted to put that out. But they do say research on 7 to 11-month-old infants have found speech sounds stimulate the auditory area of the brain and regions of the cerebellum responsible for motor planning and speech. So what we're doing is by giving them words and giving them a chance to listen and then responding to any of the sounds that they make is giving them an opportunity to kind of understand and just be have the opportunity to hear lots of words. And that's what's most important, which is when we get to that word gap piece is what the kids who are lacking in their vocabulary didn't get was a lot of words in their early years of, or joint attention or responsive stuff. So I also found it fascinating that shortly after birth, newborns can perceive speech sounds that even their parents cannot detect. So some researchers believe the newborn brain is prepared to learn any human language by being capable of perceiving a wide range of speech sounds, including those that they've never heard. So researchers who are looking at children, babies in their communication call them citizens of the world because their brains don't know whether the baby will learn Russian, English, Chinese, Swahili, Japanese, Spanish, whatever. So they're born learning, being able to learn any dialect that is exposed to them at a very, very early age. And so when we talk about that multi-language learner, we will definitely talk a little bit more about that. But the ability to perceive many different speech sounds begins to diminish after about 6 months old already. So again, going back to when we were talking about that babbling at 6 months old is typically their home language and a basis of the sounds that they hear from their home language. So by 6 months old, they're already kind of weeding out that part of their brain that is open to learning all kinds of other and being aware of all kinds of other different sounds from different dialects and different languages. And they were able to kind of really research that. So they said the brain reorganizes itself from being a universal perceiver of speech and sounds to becoming specialized for the sounds that they are learning. So that's what makes them from 6 months kind of on really honed into the sounds that they hear over and over and over again in order to give them that vocabulary between 12 and 18 months when they really start using words. So this reorganization helps their brain to become an excellent language learning device as we see the growth in vocabulary over the second year of life. So yeah, so once they get to be that 12 months old, so really their brain is really open to all kinds of sounds until they're around 6 months, and then it just starts focusing in on kind of the sounds that they hear on a regular basis and the words that they hear on a regular basis, and that's kind of, again, gives them that foundation of learning and talking later. Babies are very persistent in their attempt to be understood as they slowly add language to the repertoire of gestures, facial expressions, and sounds. So by 11 and 12 months, babies will be persistent in repeating or restating messages if the adult misunderstands their intent. This means that babies will add their message, change their message, or change their behavior to communicate with you. If you don't initially understand, the persistence is important because it shows a desire to be understood. So again, it is really important, so that when we're trying to understand what that baby says and they're getting frustrated, kind of hanging in there and saying, okay, I'm going to hang in here until I understand what you're saying, because it really teaches them to be persistent in helping people understand what they want them to know. Okay, I really like, if we could do this in person, there was like a really cool little brainstorming strategy. So there were some handouts that I had sent to you all, and this is just something that you guys can look at when you have time. But the handout on it was handout 3.3. It was the communication milestones from 12 to 36 months. So the activity was really taking that page and kind of dividing up all of those milestones and putting them into, did you think that was from 12 to 18 months or 18 to 24 months? And so it was just really interesting. So it would be something that if, you wanted to talk about. And then I gave you some really good strategies to support communication skills from birth to 12 months. So, that would be good. There's a parent handout that I gave you too, but I actually like 3.2. The handout 3.2 for parents, if you give that to them and kind of help them know what they can do to help their baby talk from birth to 12 months. Casey, you had talked about, what do we do when we don't get a baby, or if you have a 5-month-old that the PT is working with, that would be a good handout for the OT or the PT to share with the family and just say, hey, just, the language is really important. I just found this and, wanted to hand this off to you. So, sharing something like that with them is really, would be really helpful. Because what we really want to stress with our families, especially with me working in early intervention also, is the importance of communication development before they even are expected to talk. And again, that's where we're trying to kind of get in there early and make some differences with families. So any other questions or comments up this far with the milestones from birth to from birth to 12 months?
This is Megan McGee from Infant Toddler Services of Johnson County. Here, I'll turn my video.
There you are.
I was just going to mention that that's also one of the hard parts about navigating vision and hearing early on, when we have those kiddos where vision is really impacted and then we're still learning about hearing. Really supporting the families through that, because those kids are missing out on some of those really important early milestones when it comes to learning communication at an early age. So I just wanted to, I know everyone knows that, but just pointing out that the importance of, even when I currently have a lot of kiddos that have some vision things going on, but they're getting cleared from ophthalmology, but then we're coming to find out that they've got a cortical visual impairment that wasn't maybe necessarily identified. So really making sure that we ask those questions on a regular basis about how's vision going, how's hearing going, and try to see some of those signs if they are not going or working properly.
Yeah, I agree. Sometimes we kind of overlook that vision and hearing piece. We just assume they can hear and see. So it is really important to talk to families about, do you really feel like your child can hear or see? So, and like that newborn that I was telling you, she's 4 months old, but that I had seen yesterday, she's got a lot of issues with retinopathy of prematurity, the ROP, and then she passed her newborn hearing test, but they really are not sure. So they're going to do one of those hook her up, the augmented, I'm not really familiar with it, but yeah, hook her up.
I think that's the technical term, hooker upper. I think.
Thank you. Yeah, that's that thingamajiggy that they put, and then they determine if she can hear or not. But yes, so but it is really important, because she passed her newborn hearing screening, but they're not sure for sure that she can hear. But yeah, so I think that that's really important.
I know I'm speaking to the choir on that, but I just happened to see a kid earlier before this, and it made me think of that.
Yeah, that always kind of is in our mind, isn't it? Like I said, so I had done that evaluation on that little one last night. So Okay, any other comments? Okay. All right, so when we're looking at the communication milestones, so honestly, we kind of move right through the communication milestones from 12 to 24 months because pretty much everything that was built on in that first year comes through in the next, in that second year of life. So, your 12-month milestones include, first words and, they caution against being unable to walk and talk at the same time because, as I had mentioned earlier, that part of the brain that is using communication also uses motor. They say that children that are learning a lot of communication and language are often not able to just pick up and walk at the same time. So if they're walking, they may not be talking, and if they're talking, they may not be walking, just for reasons that it kind of uses the same parts of the brain. And they say it can be exhausting for little ones to be working on all of that at one time. So kind of if they're talking really well, but not walking really well yet, just to kind of give it some time. 18-month milestones, including pointing to several clothing items on request. I would say more body parts than clothing items, but says no meaningfully. So we all know that comes along. That's almost like, some of their first words is like no. Also when they're developing that sense of self as they move from 18 to 24 months old is really important. Usually they echo the last word or the most pertinent word spoken by an adult. So if you're talking about Sparky the dog, they might be like dog, 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 something like that. They should have around 18 months, they should have about 15 to 20 words that they use on a regular basis. Just being able to name and point, not necessarily stringing anything together. They say use his name to refer to self. Again, I'm not quite sure I've seen a whole lot of that. I don't know, maybe you guys have. I'm not sure. Imitates environmental sounds. So that's like vroom, with the car, and like there's the siren, woo, 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 or, barking like a dog, those kind of things. So those sounds that they've heard a lot, that they should be imitating those around 18 months. From 18 to 24 months, use 3-word sentences. I honestly don't know. I'm on the fence with that one too. Maybe you guys feel like that is very typically appropriate for 18 to 24 month old, or maybe just working in early intervention doesn't provide me the opportunity to see, a 20-month-old using 3-word sentences, but who knows. 50 plus words. I think if you're counting up all the words and sounds they can make, that makes sense. Imitates and requests new words. So this is the point where they can become like little sponges, like they repeat everything that you say. Name 3 common objects or items in a book. Understand a reference to rooms in their own house, like go to the kitchen. Identify 6 body parts. Understand compound or 2-part sentences, like go to the door and get your shoes, that kind of stuff. Follow a direction that includes 2 separate and distinct requests, which is what that was. Answer simple questions with more than a yes or a no response, like what, where, or who. Like, where is your sister? What are you doing? I had the cutest little guy. He was 2, and he obviously was not eligible for our program, but he was telling me how he felt he had gone through this very spooky experience, but he kept saying it was really spooky, and I just thought that was really adorable. So it kind of depends on what kind of foundation they have. Some of them really tend to understand a whole lot of what's going on around them and be able to say it back. So the milestones from 24 to 36 months is use 2 to 3 sentences at a time. They should have 300 to 1,000 words. Name 8 common items and pictures. They should at this point be able to recite some nursery rhymes or sing a familiar song or Wheels on the Bus or any of those things that sing their ABCs, that kind of stuff. Understand common verbs, adjectives, and prepositions. And so we're talking about, jumping and running and, prepositions of, I think it's behind the couch, like a ball or something's behind the couch and they know to look behind the couch. Engages in conversations using short sentences, asks what, where, and when questions, and can be understood by others about 80% of the time. So Anybody have any comments or feedback about those milestones? So much of this communication and language focuses, like I said, on that that birth to 12 months and how much information and learning happens in communication before they even say their first word. Okay, so here's the word gap piece that I was talking about. I find this fascinating, although I've seen it. I was a CASA volunteer for many years also, so I obviously preferred the babies, so I worked with a lot of families with small children, and I could see this word gap for my own eyes, but they found that the number of words that children heard from 7 months to 3 years varied by socioeconomic status. And so, as I said, they were talking about children from families receiving welfare had about 606, or they heard about 616 words per hour on average when they did any kind of a research study. So this was that research study that they did where they put recorders on families, and families agreed to, wear these recording devices of how they talk to their children over the course of like a week or something like that. And so that's how they came up with this. They determined that the working class, children heard about, 1,250 words per hour in working class. And in the professional home, where there are professional, families, heard roughly about 2,153 words per hour. So following this trend, by 4 years old, children from professional families would have heard almost 30 million words more than children living in poverty. So again, if we're talking about communication being developed by what they hear, this would have a significant impact on a child's development, as we had talked about before. So interestingly, Hart and Risley, who did this study, noted that it wasn't just the number of words that was different in high and low income families. It was also the quality of the language. Professional families used more encouragements, more questions, more conversation, and more descriptive language. Families receiving welfare used more prohibitions and commands such as don't do that, and less back and forth conversation. It was more commands, stop that, don't do that. Again, making a difference. In 2013, a small study of 20 toddlers found that this same type of language gap was apparent with even younger children. This study found that by 18 months old, toddlers from disadvantaged families were already several months behind more advantaged children in language proficiency. So I think that's something that when I see children all over the Kansas City area, from very nice, beautiful parts of Kansas City to other parts of Kansas City, I can see where the quality of the language spoken to children it can be different. Not in all households, but in some. There are also significant socioeconomic differences in neurocognitive development, particularly with regard to language. These differences appear to be due to differences in children's home experiences as well, which is what, Leslie, I think you were talking about as far as being that social emotional development piece and that responsive piece. And, children need to feel safe and secure in order to learn. And so not only is the word gap a problem, but if, again, going back to that social emotional development, if a child doesn't feel safe and secure and they're kind of on edge, they're not going to be as open to hearing and discriminating different sounds. Research has found that there is a correlation between socioeconomic status and the degree of hemispheric specialization in the left inferior frontal gyrus, a region that includes Broca's areas, which contain motor neurons involved in speech production and is responsible for processing speech. So I had to read that because that's a lot of complicated stuff. Simply put, children from higher socioeconomic statuses, households showed more efficiency and specialization in this part of their brain, whereas children from lower SES households showed more diffuse or general brain activation. So again, I think in simple terms, what it says is that this really promotes growth in that part of the brain that is able to distinguish language and understand and move forward, where children who are, from a lower SES household tend to generalize those languages those sounds. So So yeah, so we look at the brain architecture and how we do know that social emotional development does affect brain development in children. That's what I'm actually going to talk about when I come back on my Lunch and Learn on the 23rd, is how toxic stress and ongoing toxic stress actually changes the brain development of infants and toddlers. And so I can see why that would definitely affect language development. Let's see, any other questions about the word gap? Because like I said, it is quite interesting to know that the word gap is real, and that what children hear and how they feel about themselves can have a great impact on what they're able to learn.
Michelle, this is Mary Ellen. Something that's been going through my mind as you were describing this is it's about 15 years old in terms of their research in this comment about the word gap. I wonder how different it would look if they research now with all the professional families that use so much tablet and screen time for their children, whether that number looks less, more, or about the same. And if there's a difference there between the status.
I agree. In the families that I have been seeing over the last, 8 months or so, there's definitely those that don't have a problem with lots of screen time. And I've seen those families that are extremely careful with the amount of screen time that their children have. So I agree with that. And I wonder if that isn't, because in my eyes, in the families that I work with, isn't necessarily a socioeconomic status thing. I have some that are, from a lower socioeconomic status that really limit screen time. And like you said, those that are from, a higher one that say, go get your tablet and entertain yourself. So it would be interesting to see, because it is an older study. But yeah, that screen time is something, it's definitely something that's had an impact, I think, on development of infants and toddlers over the last 5 to 10 years.
Michelle, is there any research that's talks about like culturally? So we've talked about like I can't even speak today, socioeconomic status. But I'm wondering, like, culturally, that would mean differences in words and language and, emphasis on different things. I know you mentioned that early on when kids are learning to babble and that kind of stuff. But I would think, is there any research that talks about that?
So are you specifically talking about like a multi-language learner, or are you talking about a child that's learning a different language? Or like, living in like a different culture? Because I think it depends. So a child should be learning, from what this growing brain curriculum says, it doesn't matter what language the child's learning. It's really exposure to how much of that responsive that they're getting in any language that they're learning.
Okay.
So
I think that answered what I'm asking. Yes.
Okay.
That's what this curriculum is talking about. If not,
I have a multi-language section, and that's really interesting about like what it looks like. Because I know that I have a multi-language learner on mine, and he doesn't have as much vocabulary as someone who's only learning one language. And I will talk about that and what that research shows with that. So, okay, so, I have a video I wanted to show from Christ to Conversation. Can you all see this?
Michelle, are we supposed to be, I can't see a video.
Oh, well, thank you. I didn't know that. Thank you. I didn't know. Because I can't see when I share, I can't see Let me see. So what are you seeing?
I see your Dropbox.
Oh, it's not showing the video. Okay. You know what? I'm going to skip the video because it just shows what we probably see every day anyway in babies interacting with their parents and how important that is. But I really wanted to get to this multi-language thing. Do you all deal with a lot of families who have like a multi-language learner? Are you interested in the multi-language piece? Okay. I'm just looking at the time and I'm thinking that it was really helpful for me to look at the multi-language piece because of the Spanish, English, a lot of stuff going on. So Stacy, did you have something?
Nope, I was just gonna say that that multi-language thing sounds good, yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna move on to that. Okay, so let me get back to my okay, so can you see my screen now? So for now, it's not working. Sometimes technology really hurts me.
Sometimes I've noticed on Zoom, if you don't have it on like if you do try to put it on full screen, it doesn't always work. But if you just keep it on like the minimized screen, it might work.
Like this one, can you see this one?
Mm-hmm.
This is my screen. I can just go down to, so can you see that? There we go. Can you see that? Okay, thank you. Okay, so just some early communication. We're going to tune in. We're going to, tune into what they're saying. We're going to talk more and we're going to take turns. We're going to immediately follow up and to what they're talking about, respond, just kind of, those are called contingent responses where we kind of come back and talk about what they're saying. Following the child's lead, again, is really important. If a child picks up a book, they're like, oh yeah, look at the book, and we're going to share and label and comment, that kind of stuff. So, then we're talking about expansions and recasts, which I'm pretty sure you all do, and that is, if the child says the truck's going fast, you can say, oh yeah, that truck is going really fast to the fire, and you just, expand on what they're already saying. Or modeling is the other piece. That recasting is really just modeling proper and correct grammar, like put the shoes on my foots, and you say, oh sure, you want your shoes on your feet, I can help you with that. And you're not correcting them, you're just giving them the right words to use. So, and then shared reading, and then there was another video, but I'm gonna go into the multi-language. Sorry. I know I only have so much time, but I really wanted to talk about this because I think it's really, like I said, I work with a lot of families who also are learning 2 different languages, and they've really found that the executive functioning skills of a child learning 2 separate languages is really higher. They think more flexibly. They can demonstrate a lot of self-control, focus attention, and turn out distractions. They also have found to have better working memory, which is that, I've walked into this room to grab, a soda out of the fridge or something like that, and they can remember, where, some of us as we get older can walk into a room and say, why am I here? I don't remember what I came in here for. So that working memory on children who are bilanguage learners tend to hold and process and update information over short periods of time more than monolingual children do. And so it was really interesting, kind of some of their research on the bilanguage user, and their neural responses extend into the prefrontal cortex, which is probably related to that executive functioning. So that executive functioning is in your frontal cortex. And so a lot of that bilanguage will go, we'll start moving into that executive functioning, like long before like a monolanguage learner will. So when we talk about, so these next few slides are really like, I'm going to put up a statement and it's going to say true or false to that statement on whether or not we believe this or not. And it says, babies are born with the ability to distinguish the unique sounds of any language in the world. And as you know, that this is true because this is what we talked about, up to about 6 months old, that baby can learn any kind of sound. So like a baby, so babies in Japan don't have, I mean, the Japan dialect doesn't have an R sound to it. So babies in Japan who are past like that language piece of 6 months or more usually can't say the R sound either after about 6 months old. So I found this really fascinating that while the statement is true, that the ability to distinguish unique sounds of any language is there, it's only there until about 6 to 8 months. And then that starts going into where that child only learns that primary language. And they begin to lose that ability to learn other sounds from about 6 to 8 months. So, again, for example, Japanese children who never hear the R sound in their first year of life lose the ability to make the R sound as they grow, just as their parents also cannot make that sound. So we know this is true, that babies are born being able to learn any language that they want. They do start to lose that over time if they're not exposed to another language. So exposure to more than one language in the early years cause confusion for young children. And this is false. The studies have shown that children who learn 2 languages simultaneously are not confused and in fact reach language milestones in similar time frames to those of children who learn only 1 language. However, it will typically take multi-language learners longer to develop proficiency in both languages because they are building and using 2 separate systems. So this is what I see in the child that I'm working with whose parents lived in Honduras for a while and are now back in the States. He has the ability to use both languages. He's just not as proficient in English as we would expect for his age, because he's also, you know, if you put the proficiency levels together and you added them up, you know, he would be very proficient. However, in each of these languages, he's not as proficient if he was only learning 1 language. But over time, he will catch up, is kind of what they're saying. Young children who are learning 2 languages typically have a smaller vocabulary than their monolingual peers. This is false, which again, it says a recent examination of the research on dual language learners found that while they may develop smaller vocabularies in each language, if children's vocabularies in both languages are combined, the total number of words as a dual language learner knows is usually comparable to their single language peers. So, and this was very true with him. He didn't have as many English words, but he had just as many Spanish words. And so he had, you know, the same vocabulary. Again, adding them together, he had the same vocabulary for an age-appropriate child, just not of the same language. So, any questions about that? And I think this is why sometimes we look at them and we think they have a language delay when they're learning 2 languages, but they are trying to process that. I mean, they're trying to flip through all their little files in their head and say, which language is this and what word do I need to use? Which is pretty amazing, actually.
Hi, this is Nadine. I have a quick question. Well, maybe not so much a question. Sorry, I've been off because my hair's crazy. So, you know, I was thinking about that phrase in the early years, that in 2 slides ago, that children who are learning more than 1 language in their early years. Because a lot of times I'll come across kiddos that, you know, parents are considered bilingual, and the kiddos maybe for like their first year and a half only heard maybe like 1 of their languages, and then they're being introduced to maybe like another language around 18 months old. Or some of our Spanish speaking families, a kiddo is exposed to 2 languages once like their older sibling goes to school and comes home and starts using English words around them, or they start watching English TV shows and things like that. I've always considered in the early years, like before like 4 or 5 years old, as far as like language development. So I just kind of wanted to clarify that, because I think sometimes we attribute language delay because maybe that something else is being introduced. But I feel like when we really look at where they're at, we do see an actual language delay or not if we're looking at, you know, them overall. Does that make sense? I think I just rambled a little bit. So.
Yeah. So again,
like
what
4
they
or 5 years old. is what we
Yeah,
would
4 or 5 years old. And I have a slide on that. I'll just move to it. It's let's see. It's here. The earlier that a child is exposed to a second language, oops, daisy. Oops, daisy. The more proficient the child is likely to become in speaking it. While that is true, studies show a clear relationship between the age of exposure to a language and the child's success in learning the language. So all they're saying is that a baby is wired to hear and learn different sounds more quickly in that birth to 8 months. It doesn't mean that a child who's 4 or 5 or 6 can't learn another language. It does say here, really, the older a child is when exposed to a language for the first time, the less skilled the child is expected to become in the second language. This is true even when the second language is introduced as early as 4 to 6 years old. So the greatest success in learning a second language is seen in people who are exposed to the language in infancy or early childhood. So I think you're still seeing that a 4 to 6 year old can still very easily learn a language, much easier than like us as adults can, but it's still going to be harder for them than if they had been exposed in infancy. Is that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Yeah.
I appreciate it.
I also had another one about children with language delay or impairment, and should they be taught 2 languages? And I think you kind of touched on that too. And so we run it.
I did. I talk about that.
Yeah. So they say that the research on bilingual students with language challenges shows that these children are still able to acquire proficiency in both languages. So it's no different than when we help a child with motor planning in English. That they would still also be able to use that in their second language. So it says they would face similar challenges in mastering any language. For example, if they have difficulty with language processing, they will have that challenge in both English and Spanish. At present, there is no scientific evidence that children with language difficulties should be limited to only one language. So, yes.
I you're saying that because I have so many families that are so discouraging of themselves that are bilingual, and I try to show them the benefits of being bilingual in the world. I mean, I'd give my right arm to be a bilingual person, and also the importance of keeping their language that they feel they're connected to, and not just worrying about their kid learning English so that they can go to school and things like that, that it's okay to do both. And then I just help them with strategies. Well, I think we all do. We all help them with strategies on how to kind of sort it out so the kiddos kind of got some kind of semblance of structure and learning it. Maybe like we read books in one language, but we do dinner time in another language, or usually it's based around routines. So
yeah, I know the family that I was working with too was really struggling with whether or not they did the right thing in teaching their child Spanish and living in the Honduras and those kind of things. But I told them, I said, in the end, it's really a gift to be able to be bilingual. And it may look like this now, but he's really going to start to understand both of these languages. I also wanted to touch on this. When learning 2 languages, it doesn't matter how much of each language the child is exposed to, as long as the child hears words in both languages each day. And they say that's false. And this comes from like when you have the multi-language learners who would say, well, so advised one parent to speak one language to the child consistently while the other parent spoke the second language consistently. However, research tells us that we don't need to be so rigid, and that one parent and one language approach is not particularly effective in raising bilingual children. What is most important when raising multi-language learners is that children have roughly the same exposure to high quality input in each language each day, speaking and listening. So it's not a matter of just being talked to in that language, it's a matter of being interacted with and having that quality interaction within that language. In many cases, one language becomes dominant in a child's life. For example, if a child is learning Spanish as well as English, English may become the child's dominant language if that is what he hears all day at school and childcare. This is also why it is so important for parents to use the home language as much as possible around their children if the goal is for them to be bilingual. This maximizes the likelihood that children will be exposed to the rich, high-quality, descriptive language that we know supports language development. A fluent foundation in their home language will help children in learning English as well. So I think it's really important. Like I said, I do remember the times where people would say, well, we only speak, you know, Spanish at home and they only speak English at school. But it really helps if you can kind of combine both of those. So if the school would introduce different, you know, have some labels for table to be table, but table also to have the Spanish word for table and incorporate that. Any other questions around that multi-language
I
learning
have
piece?
a question. So what would you say to parents who are, it's really important to them that their kids learn English, but they themselves as the parents are not English proficient, like it's not their native language, but they're trying to speak to their child in English in their non-proficient way? What do you think about that?
I don't know. Are you thinking that they might be promoting like poor English use of poor English skills? English
Not so much for English, but they're not getting their parents' native language because their parents are not speaking it. They're speaking English instead.
Yeah, I think that's what this is kind of going back to is letting families know the importance of a child's home language and like the language and the culture in which they were born into and how important that is. It really goes a long way for their, not only their learning of another language, but their esteem of saying I came from this culture. Yeah, I think it would really depend on the family. I think it would be quite helpful if the family would speak their home language, you know, for the child in order to learn. Are you saying that they're not teaching their child the home language at all? They're trying to be having this child learn only English?
I mean, it varies, but most typically maybe the parents would speak to each other in their native language, but they speak to the children trying to speak in English.
Okay, with the intent that that child will learn English better, right, faster. Okay, yeah. You know, I don't really have the answer for that. I just, you know, I know from what they're saying in this multi-language learning is that if you're wanting your child to learn both languages, then you need to give them that quality interaction from both languages, and not just one or the other. So, you know, it's really hard. It's really hard for me to tell families what to do when they're faced with the multi-language situation, because I've never been faced with that. And so I don't know. I really don't have the answers for that. So that's really hard. Any other questions on the multi-language learner? Like I said, I found it very interesting because sometimes it does appear like they're delayed in like English if they're also learning a second language when that's not necessarily the case. They may have fewer English words than would be typically expected, except for that they have this whole other language of words that they have themselves too. So strategies for supporting multi-language learners are key caregiving words. So again, really encouraging childcare. So I work in, like I said, promoting childcare's infants and toddlers. So if they have a child that speaks a different language, it is really, we really promote cultural, you know, dolls and really like have that parent bring some empty food boxes from, you know, what they would use at home so that they could put that in their dramatic play kitchen area, so that there's a part of that child's culture that is embedded in their learning at childcare. And so, you know, kind of making sure that as a teacher, you kind of know what some of those caregiving words are, like where the bathroom. And so when the child comes to you and they need something, that they're able to speak to you and that teacher is able to meet their needs. Teaching words like can I play to help them be able to really engage with other kids is really important, and helping them make connections between words, like objects, use both languages if possible, translate materials, and get lots of children's books. Like in Spanish, we always promote lots of Spanish books in the childcare. So, so some key messages over this whole thing is that adults play obviously a critical role in supporting early communication development through the back and forth interactions with children, you know, beginning at birth, and really reinforcing that back and forth and all of that communication that happens behind the scenes, I feel like, before the child actually starts communication intentionally. Communication will definitely begin with observation, with babies noticing, your cues and you noticing the baby's cues, and nonverbal communication, building on and expanding and extending children's language to help them develop a more mature and complex communication ability over time. And again, they really stress that multi-language learners have a really rich back and forth equivalent in both languages. Like I said, so it's not just hearing that other language, it's actually being, really engulfed in that language of being able to use it back and forth, just like you would English. And so that really promotes a lot of that multi-language learning that they have. Sharing books and stories with young children promotes the development of communication skills. So, so I know I talked really fast at the end because I wanted to get it all in, but I hope that was helpful. Again, this is a really good curriculum. I really like the Growing Brain curriculum. It really kind of promotes how much brain growth and development happens between birth and 3 and birth to 5, and how much we can really make a difference in those years. And so it's really good. But does anybody have any questions? I'm going to stop sharing at this point so I can see everybody. All right. So again, like I said, I felt like I talked a lot. Does anybody have any questions or anything? Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for coming to this. I hope it was helpful. If you have any questions, Stacy has my email, Mary Ellen has my email, Monica has my email. If you have any questions, you want more information, or if there's something that I can find for you, I would be happy to send it to you. So just let me know. I would be happy to help.
Thank you, Michelle. This was
All right.
really helpful.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate that. All right. Well, thank you all. Monica, I will just ask if I could get a sign-in sheet for this. Did you do a sign-in sheet?
No, but I think I can
just
pretty much come up with the list. So
okay,
yeah,
that would be great. I just need to turn it in for my hours so that
okay.
It goes towards that.
Yep. Does it have to be actual signatures, or can it just be names?
It can just be names.
Okay, cool. Yep, I'll shoot that in an email to you.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Thank you all. You all have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.